Hey guys, Ramsey here. Welcome to another video. Today we have a very special episode and it's going to be round 2, so episode part 2 of our launch series. And I had great feedback on part 1. So the whole idea was to basically discuss a little bit about the history of these houses and maybe show one of the very first creations that the house ended up putting out. So maybe one for women and one for men, for example, and talk about how the house ended up getting launched and what timing, what era it got launched in, who were they sort of competing against, a little bit of background, and then show the fragrances from my collection. So obviously, these are going to be fragrances from my collection. There are some houses that I have bottles of that I just don't have the original release, or either the male or the female release, and so it's kind of hard to talk about. Even newer houses like let's say Roja Dove, when he was launched, he launched with 3 fragrances, Enslaved and a couple others. I don't have any of them, and so it's kind of hard to do a launch video with 0 of the fragrances. So these are going to focus on houses in my collection that I have fragrances to show you, obviously. But there is a part 1 to this, so if you want to go check out part 1, it only happened a couple videos back. You can easily find it. And so this is going to be part 2, some of the most sort of requested houses that I did not do in part 1. I hope you guys enjoy the video. I like bringing these unique concepts, but in a nutshell, you guys have to remember that this is just basically an excuse to talk about perfume. That's all this is. It's an excuse to have these conversations with you guys on a topic that I absolutely love. It's a joy and an honor, and I hope you guys enjoy listening to them as much as I enjoy doing these episodes. Okay, so let's get started with my scent of the day. But before I tell you scent of the day, let me tell you the house. And this is going to be included in this video. Actually, scent of the day worked out well. It's going to be included in this video because this is the very first masculine release from this house, but it's not the first release from the house. The house is Parfums Caron, a very classic French house that was founded in 1904 by Ernst Daltroff. And Mr. Daltroff, over the years, has created many perfumes for the House of Caron. Now, in 2019, a Luxembourg-based brand actually ended up purchasing the House of Caron, and that house, the Luxembourg brand's name is called Cattleya. Cattleya. I hope I'm pronouncing that at least somewhat properly, but Cattleya. Cattleya Finance, I guess, is the name. And I'll tell you something I discovered recently that really sort of hurt my heart if it's true. But what ended up happening in 1904, Ernst Daltroff chose a very short name for people to try to remember. He wanted something that was basically easy to remember in several different languages, but still be associated with France. So he ended up choosing the name Caron, which the house was first located at 10 Rue de la Paix in Paris. Sorry to all my Parisian speakers whose ears are probably profusely bleeding after hearing me butcher all of that. But 10 Rue de la Paix, and I'm sure I'll be corrected in the comments, but I don't speak French, so, you know, the Texas accent, the Texan in me just will not allow it. In 1906, apparently he met his business partner and they went into business, and, you know, the process started to begin. So the very first fragrance from the house is a perfume called Narcissus Noir from 1911, which I've never smelled. And apparently it was a pretty big hit. But for me, probably the #1 Caron fragrance I've never smelled that I would love to smell one day is, obviously I would love to smell Narcissus Noir. I'm sure it's extremely rare, but there's a vintage fragrance called Tabac Blonde that came out in 1919. And it really sort of focused on the newfound freedoms of women after World War I. While World War I was going on and the men were off fighting, women sort of took on new roles, and they had in society, they sort of had new roles in society, and with their newfound freedom came smoking. And so many of these feminine fragrances of the times, things like Tabac Blonde, and also I'll just show you one that probably could have been on the list, but I didn't think about it, but I'll just show you real quick here. This is Molinard's Amanita. This one also focuses on the tobacco note, oriental style tobacco for women. So I would love to smell Tabac Blanc one day. I've never smelled it before, but what ended up happening in 1934 is, so men mainly used colognes or I guess aftershaves back then. And Dutroff wanted to convince them that men should wear perfume, proper perfume. And so what ended up being released is a fragrance called Pour un Homme. And Pour un Homme is my scent of the day today. And the original Caron bottles were put in flacons from Baccarat and Daume. But this is actually a vintage bottle of Caron Pour un Homme. I'm not exactly sure when this is from. I would guess it's probably sometime in the 80s, is my guess, just by looking at the bottle. But I honestly don't know with 100% certainty. You can see the 77 proof down there. But this, to me, is basically one of the best sort of... if you want to study lavender, I'm not saying it's one of the best lavender fragrances, because I don't think it's one of the best lavender fragrances to my nose, but I do think it's historically one of the most important lavender fragrances. So if you want to study what proper vintage lavender used to be, this is the fragrance you need to wear. Caron's Pour un Homme is basically a very simple creation. It is lavender, lavender, and vanilla and musk. It's lavender, provincial lavender, vanilla, and musk with just a little bit of amber. I think these older bottles used some sort of animalic aspect. Now, if you listen to the brand's founder, he says, well, today the fragrance hasn't changed. You know, the stuff we're bottling today is the exact same one that we were bottling in 1934. And that's what he used to say. I don't know if it's still true or not, because I found some very unsettling news. Actually, if you go to Parfumo and you go to Caron's Pour un Homme and you look it up, it says it was last marketed by Catalea Finance, which worries me that basically this is discontinued if that's true. Now, maybe it's just switching over to a new bottle, and this version from 1934 is discontinued and there'll be a new version coming out. But either way, Ernst Dutroff is actually the perfumer of this. So he's not just the founder, he was also the perfumer and the actual perfumer. They actually did what they said back then. So really interesting. I mean, lavender fragrance. Most people think lavender is purple because it looks purple. It's not. Lavender is actually green. And that's where the green color in Caron's Pour un Homme comes from. Very traditionally masculine note is lavender, although the vanilla in this makes this very unisex for me. So even though this says Caron Pour un Homme, don't let the homme bother you if you're a lady out there and you're interested in a very interesting lavender fragrance. This is definitely one to put on the sniff list. In fact, there was a Celine fragrance that came out very recently that LVMH put out, and it was something like $350. I forget exactly which one it was. It could have been Rimbaud. I can't remember which one, but there was a, I think it was Rimbaud. Don't quote me on it, but there was a Celine fragrance that came out last year, I think it was, that had this lavender vanilla combination that smelled very much like Caron's Pour un Homme. They added like a note of wheat or something, or barley or rye or something like that to just twist up the composition a little bit so they could have an excuse to charge $350, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, and they market that as niche and unisex, and people pay $350, and you know, they don't understand the history. And maybe if it's not Rimbaud, there is a Celine fragrance that smells very much like this. I have some more Celine decants that I'll be getting through on the channel and doing reviews on very soon. Very unimpressive brand, extremely unimpressive brand. I am not a fan of Celine. So Caron's Pour un Homme is the very first masculine from the house. Okay, so next on the list is going to be the one everyone was saying I missed on the last video, and it just ended up turning this into a two-parter. But that is the house of Chanel. Chanel is one of the most iconic, basically, fashion houses, if you will. She kind of grew up from a, I guess, inauspicious start into one of the biggest icon brands, a global fashion house, if you will. And in 1910, she opened her very first store at 21 Rue Cambon. Very interesting address. If you keep that in mind, if you pay attention to her creations, you'll know that there actually is a 31 Rue Cambon perfume. But her first store was at 21 Rue Cambon at age 27. So she was a very young woman when she started this process. And she grew very quickly. In 1913, she chose Dunhill, a seaside resort in Normandy, as her second boutique, where she started offering sportswear. In 1915, the first Cartier boutique opens in Biarritz. In 1918, the famed Chanel store at 31 Rue Cambon opens. There you go. 1918 was when 31 Rue Cambon, one of the most iconic stores in fashion. And it remains the brand's headquarters to this day. 1921, for us perfume heads, that is the year. 1921 is the year that the iconic No. 5 fragrance ended up coming out by Ernst Beau. And named both because it was the 5th scent presented to Coco Chanel. So this is the rumor, that Ernst Beau presented her almost with a, what do they call those things when you test out whiskey or something, like a flight of fragrances, and said, here, smell them and tell me which one you like. And it was the 5th one that she smelled that he had put a lot of aldehydes in that she really loved. And for her superstitious belief and the number being lucky. So it's sort of a two-parter with Chanel's No. 5. This is actually a vintage bottle of the cologne, the Eau de Cologne version, which is discontinued. I'm very curious if this is really held up, because I bought it and it was, I don't know, right close to where the Chanel logo begins, or at the bottom of the logo. So it had a pretty big hunk missing. I've used, obviously, some of it, but I would like to get maybe a newer, better bottle in better condition and just see if Chanel No. 5 Eau de Cologne is exactly what I'm smelling, or if that bottle has turned a little bit. But that's my preferred, my most favorite version of No. 5, because it has, you have to sort of, I don't know, plant your flag somewhere and put your feet in the ground. There's so many No. 5s. And the Eau de Cologne version has more of this civet and animalics, and I think maybe even a little bit more vetiver. I think it's more traditionally masculine. Men used to wear No. 5 a lot, and it actually was not until 1955 when they ended up launching the only men's fragrance to be created during Coco Chanel's lifetime, and that is blended by Henri Robert, Guy Robert's uncle, I believe it was, and it's called Pour Monsieur. And Pour Monsieur is sort of this woody, citrusy chypre. It's a citrus aromatic chypre, if you will. My least favorite style of chypre fragrance. The old school EDT is a proper chypre, which is what this bottle is. There's also an eau de parfum version of this, which initially was issued as what they called the eau de toilette concentré in the late 80s. They ended up discontinuing the eau de toilette concentré, and now they issue it as what's called an eau de parfum. It's much more vanillic, and it's much more palatable for me. It's easier to swallow. If you listen to my good friend Rich Mitch from across the pond talk about the eau de toilette of Pour Monsieur, he will mention that the lemon in the top and the citrus is almost turned to bleach on his skin. And you know what? While those words probably wouldn't have popped in my head to describe it, I actually agree with his assessment. I think that's a good way to describe it. There's this strange reaction with this fragrance, and it only lasts about an hour. So I don't hate it, but it's not my favorite fragrance, but you have to give it its prominence as, being one of the iconic Chanel fragrances, the only fragrance to be created during Coco Chanel's lifetime for men. That's how she thought a man should smell. So, very reserved and elegant, you know, very old school money is what I think about when I think about Pour Monsieur. Okay, next on the list is going to be the House of Cartier. Now, Cartier is a very interesting house. I have a lot of information on them. They're headquartered in Paris, France, obviously. They do about $6 billion in annual revenue. They're a huge premium jewelry watch. They're jewelers, basically, is what they were. That's how they were founded. They were founded in 1847, and actually the company remained under family control until 1964. Hell of an accomplishment, I must say. They're still in Paris, although they've been a wholly owned subsidiary of Swiss's Richemont Group, which they have more than 200 stores in 125 countries. And they are basically one of the most prestigious jewelry manufacturers in the world, if you will. They're constantly in Forbes, you know, top 50 to 75 most valuable brands as far as name recognition goes. You know, they have a long history of sales to royalty. And, you know, interestingly enough, King Edward VII of Great Britain referred to Cartier as the jeweler of kings and the king of jewelers. How's that for a praise? You know, how's that for giving Cartier some flowers? It's interesting. If you look at his coronation in 1902, King Edward VII ordered 27 tiaras issued a royal warrant to Cartier in 1904. Some of those tiaras, like the, or some of the, what would you call it? I guess Art Deco designs and wristwatches and jewelry from, you know, the late 1800s and early 1900s is just worth millions. One of the Art Deco designs is a colorful little piece of jewelry that looks like it comes from a, I don't know, like a flea market or something. And it's like a $1 million bracelet. It's unbelievable. But some of the stuff does not look like it comes from a flea market. If you've seen some of the diamonds and sapphires and just how ornate some of the jewelry is, it's absolutely unbelievable. And then, of course, if you get to the wristwatches is where, that's where my mouth really starts to drool. Rich Mitch was talking about trying to maybe find a Santos watch, which was Cartier's first men's wristwatch. And, you know, just all of the ways that they've sort of changed the industry and what they've done in their time is almost inspiring. You have to give it to them. You see the famous people that they have, you know, adorned with their jewelry, people like Elizabeth Taylor, and there's just so many celebrities, Princess Diana, Jackie Kennedy, Andy Warhol, even people like YSL, stuff like that. You know, it's just countless celebrities have worn their jewelry. So that's kind of where their bread and butter comes in. So for people like us, the frag heads, the jewelry side of things is always sort of front and center for Cartier, and fragrances were always seen as, like, I don't know, the red-headed stepchild. I will say in 1972, a group of investors led by Joseph Kenoy bought Cartier, and then in 74 and 76, respectively, the group repurchased Cartier London and Cartier New York. And so that's right around the time where I think Cartier started to sort of try to look at this bigger, broader strategy. And that's where fragrance really started to come into play, because they always sort of fell back on their laurels. They fell back on what they knew, right, which was jewelry making. And so the fragrance world allowed them to expand and allowed them to reach a bigger audience. People like me, for example, I'd never own a $10,000 Cartier watch, but I have their fragrances and I absolutely love it. And it's a brilliant strategy from them, right? Now, that was back then. Now, of course, they make much more affordable jewelry. But the very first, so according to Parfumo, and this is where I'll just sort of leave it open-ended. Some people, some folks have Musc de Cartier listed as the very first fragrance put out by Cartier in 1980. Other sites like Parfumo have Musc de Cartier and Santos de Cartier, both at 1981. So I'm not 100% sure if Must de Cartier came first. I've read conflicting reports, but usually the women's fragrance does come first, so it wouldn't surprise me. This is actually a vintage refill bottle that I got very lucky on eBay and won an auction years ago. No one, or whoever bid against me, wasn't serious, and I ended up getting this partial of the Pure Parfum vintage with the short ingredient list. You can see it's just ethyl alcohol and fragrance. Cartier Inc., New York, New York, 10022. And this has the UTIF, and that's a give as well. The UTIF means it's pre-1990, I think. But here it is. And this is an absolute stunner. I'll review this before it's gone. If you watch my buddy Zhao from Scented Moments, I think is his channel's name, Zhao Lima, he has been talking about how good this fragrance is on his channel. He has one of the actual Pure Parfum bottles. This is a vintage refill, and I can confirm exactly what he's been saying. I 100% agree with his assessment, drooling all over this. It's one of the best sort of green, galbanum, oriental fragrances that you can find. The rose, the vanilla, the musk, the florals, the everything. It's just class through and through, like wearing a beautiful piece of Cartier jewelry. It really is. It is. They did an unbelievable job. Jean-Jacques Dinaire was the perfumer. I'm not really familiar with his work, but I can tell you he knocked this one out of the park where he had to. He did the original cafe for women from Parfums Cafe, apparently. And that's pretty much it. I mean, he really hasn't done much else. Something called Matte Blue, which I've never really heard of before, but he has not done much. But imagine being able to sign your name off on something like this beauty. And I think it influenced later on, if you've ever smelled Crazy Krizia, comes in a fragrance that almost looks like a apple, but different from the Dior Poison Apple. Different style bottle, but you can it almost has the Apple computer logo looking top. Crazy Krizia borrows from this fragrance, I think, and that was a Dominique Ropion. So you can see sort of the influence that these fragrances had. So I think this one came first, and then they released the masculine. And the masculine fragrance that they released is one for the ages. It's one of my favorite masculine fragrances, and from one of my favorite years, 1981, and it's Santos de Cartier. I am absolutely in love with this fragrance. It could easily be a signature scent for me. It's spicy, woody. I think the spices in this influenced more and more of my favorite fragrances in the 80s. Like if you've smelled sort of the way that Guerlain's Derby does the spices mixed with the leather. This is like an intro to Guerlain's Derby. It's sort of in the same vein as Parfums Real, in the way that the spices were blended. That sort of peppery, nutmeg. There's a little tiny bit of castoreum in the base of this. Remember, this is the 80s when everyone's thinking big, bombastic, Koros, Antaeus, things like that. This is almost like the intellectual fragrance for people that didn't want to wear those type of things. But as a jeweler, it's very interesting. You know, you look at this, and it almost seems to clash. You know, you look at these 80s colors. Now they've changed the bottle. Now it's all black. And there's a built-in sprayer. It's black and silver. It's much more, but it keeps this sort of square-ish design. And I think if you've ever seen sort of the square design of the Santos watch, you'll kind of get an idea of where they began, where they started from, I think. And you can see sort of the raised little bit here. Remember, they're jewelers, kind of like Van Cleef & Arpels. And I think they just put out a brilliant bottle. And I absolutely love the fragrance. So, spot on to Cartier for putting this out. Amazing. Could easily be a signature scent of mine. Okay, next on the list, we are going to talk about a fragrance house that very few people talk about, and it is the House of Lancetti. And it was founded by a gentleman named Giuseppe Lancetti, and he was known to his friends and, I guess, co-workers and even enemies as Pinot. And he he was a complete artist, basically. He used fabrics as raw materials for his work. He had very creative, innovative techniques, sort of mixed with the typical Italian taste for luxury. And he had basically like a 70-year career in high fashion. Very impressive. He was born in 1932. Excuse me whilst I hydrate. In a Peruvian town that was very famous for its ceramics. And so he followed his native tradition, and he studied at the Art Institute and started to learn how to decorate pottery. And his passion for fashion prevailed, if you will. And so basically the story started that he took his show on the road. He went to Rome in 54, started showing as a fashion designer, started making sketches. And in 61, he opened up his own atelier. And then it just sort of snowballed from there. Where he really found success, apparently, was in 63. He was very successful with his women's collection. And he sort of revisited this very classical style and made his artistic mark. But he didn't really forget that modern women preferred comfort to formality, and that really sort of pushed him apparently into the limelight. He never accepted the jeans and t-shirt style, but he kept in the back of his mind that comfort, was preferred, was starting to be preferred. And he said, it's interesting, he said, one of his quotes was that Lancetti more than once said that modern women had lost the sense of elegance and lacked taste. So even though he was selling stuff to them that was selling, still in the back of his mind, I think he really liked the old traditional buttoned up, style, that old school formal elegance, if you will. And so long story short is the very first fragrance that he released was a masculine fragrance, believe it or not. And it was in 1982 that this came out, and I was able to secure 2 bottles of this. This is discontinued. This is unicorn stuff. It's for a vintage lover. This is what it's all about, finding stuff like this that you absolutely love. This is called Lancetti Uomo, and I know I promised to do away with these boxes. I took even more boxes up in the attic, and now there's more piling up already. But you can see sort of the short ingredient list here. So I was able to secure a couple boxes of this end of last year, I believe it was. And I'm very, very glad I did. Some people compare it to things like Jill Sanders's creations in the early 80s, with that animalic note, heavy animalic labdanum with Artemisia and thyme and clary sage. There's this very sweaty, spicy, woody, challenging, mossy 80s feel to this that I absolutely love. There's real ambergris in the base. The ingredients smell extremely high class, extremely high class. The sandalwood, the leather, I mean, the material quality will blow you away. And, oh, man, again, could easily be a signature scent for me, but this is more, this is probably more in line with what the mental image of folks who think about challenging 80s perfumery rather than something like this. And I think that's why this did so well. Not everyone wants to wear something as challenging as Lancetti Uomo every single day. But man, if the mood is right and you really knock it out of the park, let's see what the little booklet says. So the book says, fresh initial aroma based on a pleasant citrus, lavender, galbanum, aromatic clary sage, artemisia, white thyme, nutmeg, absinthe, combination mint, citrate, accentuate the freshness and diffusion of the initial aroma. The body aroma is slightly flowery with a jasmine mossy tang, genuine tree moss. The foundation aroma is animalized with a leather nuance and a touch of amber, gray amber, ambergris, and labdano cyst labdanum, boise, sandalwood, cedarwood, and patchouli. Beautiful. Beautiful little description, actually. I wish they still did this. I know it's more expensive for them to houses to print these little things, but I wish they would. I loved these back in the day. So shout out to Lancetti for putting out a hell of a first fragrance for his house, 1982 that is. I have another one from the house, but I'm not as big of a fan. It's called Il de Lancetti, and that's one that I very well could sell at some point if I ever get around to selling some of these. But Lancetti Uomo, that's definitely the kind of stuff I want to wear. Okay, next we're going to move on to Serge Lutens, who basically is, Uncle Serge is like, you know, for many people, it's their intro into the niche world. He was born in northern France in 1942. And apparently, according to the Perfume Society, he came into fashion and beauty through kind of a different back door that most people don't take, through basically his makeup and photography shoots. And he was given his very first job in a beauty salon against his will. So he said he would have rather become an actor. He didn't want to work in a beauty salon. But within a few years, he sort of developed the hallmarks for which he became known, which was this eyeshadow and this skin, short hair sort of plastered down. And he was known for wearing black, something he never strayed from. He continues to wear black, I think, even to this day. He did a stint in the army at 18 in the Algerian War. We talked a little bit about the, I think, Algerian War when we discussed YSL's, Yves Saint Laurent's history during the video one. That's a very interesting little connection there. And he basically remolded Serge Lutens, as he put it. So he fled for the glamour of Paris, carrying large photos of his makeup work, and he contacted Vogue magazine. Long story short, he worked with Christian Dior in the late 60s to create their own makeup line. So he helped Christian Dior create their own makeup line, which gave them a huge competitive advantage, and it kind of made him a little bit of a star. He ended up moving to, traveled widely, traveled to places like Japan, Morocco, where they really shaped sort of his feelings and sense of who he was. And he once told an interviewer that Morocco gave him the taste of perfume. That it was basically, according to this quote, it is very difficult to detach the olfactory senses from the other senses. However, when I can say that before my arrival in Morocco in 1968, this fifth sense was largely fallow for me. The aroma of Morocco is linked to a form of life that allows you to be an individual in a dense crowd. Beautiful. So long story short is there's a little bit of a cheat with Serge Lutens, because technically there is a technicality. There is an extremely rare, extremely expensive vintage Serge Lutens fragrance that ended up putting him on the map. Not Serge Lutens, excuse me, Shiseido fragrance that he ended up sort of building. It was a visual identity that he created for them. And the fragrance was known as Nombre Noir, dressed in matte and lustrous black, utterly timely. And Nombre Noir in 1982 is an extreme unicorn. I would love to have a bottle, would love to have it one day. I would even love a sample from someone that has a bottle so I could do a video for you guys, as it's extremely rare. But really what made Serge Lutens the first fragrance for me that I consider Serge Lutens fragrance is Féminité du Bois. And Féminité du Bois came out in 1992 as, again, a Shiseido release originally. But at the same year, 1992, he basically released the extraordinary Salon de Palais Royal in Paris opened its doors. That was where Serge Lutens was born, basically, as a brand in 1992. It says that, so they go into some of the history of it, I guess, niche perfumery from 2000. These fragrances have carried Serge Lutens' own name. So even though the Salon de Palais Royal opened its doors in 1992. I guess they're saying that Serge Lutens as a brand officially did not come into formation until the year 2000. Fair enough. So he was working with Shiseido before, and then he ended up going to Serge Lutens. But since he ended up Shiseido basically allowed him to keep the formula under his own brand name that he worked on in 1992. This gets kicked back to 1992 as a time frame, even though this version technically came much later. It came in the 2000. This got released in Serge Lutens' line, I think in 2009, if I'm not mistaken. But it was a Shiseido release in 1992. But this is fantastic. This is three all-stars. I mean, three titans of industry working together. Christopher Sheldrake, Serge Lutens himself as a perfumer, and Pierre Bourdon. And, you know, for me, this sort of set the stage for so many other Serge Lutens releases. There's so many little bits and pieces of Féminité du Bois that you smell in other Serges, like Serge Noir. If you've ever smelled Serge Noir, the way that he does sort of the spices and the that sort of cedar note is very unique to Serge fragrances. I love the way it's done. And it all sort of started here. And this was a very revolutionary fragrance. You know, Féminité du Bois technically translates to the femininity of wood. And they were saying that when they were trying to create this, the people that they were working with just didn't understand, you know, how he would go up to people and say, we're going to create a woody fragrance. And they would say, so you're going to create a woody fragrance for a man because men wear woody fragrances. And he would say, nope, we're going to create a woody fragrance for a woman. And it almost like short-circuited the brain. They just couldn't understand in the early 90s how that would possibly work. But they made it work. And this is officially marketed as unisex now. In fact, I think it leans masculine personally. But anyone can wear that. It is fantastic. Okay, next on to the house of Escada. So Escada was a luxury women's designer clothing company that was headquartered in Aschheim, Germany. And it was founded in 1978. And I say women's designer clothing company because that's really what they sort of focus on right now, if you will. And as of a couple years ago, I guess they claim to have been in 80 countries and, you know, 1,500 employees, yada, yada, yada. They went public in 1986. Interestingly enough, they went public in 86. And let's see, what else? They Marguerite Lay died in 1992. Escada was founded by Margaretha and Wolfgang Lay in Munich, Germany. Okay, so she was a former model, and she became known for basically having these very bold, feminine designs, okay? That's why I say Escada focuses sort of on their women's wear collection. And in fact, right now, Escada, interestingly enough, just to piggyback on that observation, they only focus on women's scents as well. All of the masculine scents are completely discontinued. So there you go. But they are still a creative company, and I love their old stuff. Their old work is fantastic. Great designer. That's what a designer perfume should be. Some of these Escadas, which I've talked about many a times in the past. But their very first fragrance is actually a fragrance that came out in the year 19... Some people, again, say 88, 89. Some people say 1990. Parfumo says 1990, so I'm going to go off of that. But there are sources dating this back to the late 80s. Just keep that in mind. And it's literally a fragrance named after the founder. It's called Escada Margaretha Lay. And it came out in 1990. Discontinued, apparently. But it's hyacinth, peach, bergamot, coconut in the top, with orange blossom, iris, ylang ylang, clove, and jasmine, with musk, sandalwood, and vanilla. Those are the note listings. Michel Almerac is the perfumer, so I'm sure this is a great fragrance. I've never smelled it. It's on the wish list, but I've never smelled it. And then in 1993, they released the very first Escada Masculine, which you guessed it, one of my all-time favorites and my favorite Escada fragrance, and it's called Escada Pour Homme. And so apparently the new Escada logo, the E's face each other. And in the old logos, the E's face outward. Go figure. I had no clue. If you look them up on Wikipedia, you can see the new sort of inward-facing E's, if you will. I like the old logo better. Go figure. But Escada pour Homme, I've talked about a lot on the channel. I actually just did a comparison video between, you can sort of see the bottom of it. That's a mini of Escada pour Homme and Eau de Parfum, and I have the EDT here. I ended up preferring the EDT, so save me some money hunting the Eau de Parfum. But the EDT is right up my alley. It's cognac. Imagine cognac in this sort of woody oriental amber fougere style, like Eigner's Free Life or Guerlain's Heritage or something along those lines, right? But imagine Escada sticking this beautiful cognac note on top. Boozy cognac. It's beautiful with some pimento and lots of spices. The best Escada, in my opinion, hands down. Escada pour Homme. Okay, and then we're going to go to the house of Kenzo. Now, interestingly enough, Kenzo was founded by a gentleman named Kenzo Takada. Go figure. And he was born in 1939. And Kenzo Takada was inspired by Paris. He was inspired by designers like Yves Saint Laurent and stuff like that. And he was kind of seen as a maverick, you know, kind of a free-spirited, try a bunch of things. He was known as like a ready, fire, aim guy. Don't ready, aim, and then fire. He was like a ready, fire, aim. He liked to try a lot of stuff. He was known as a maverick. And he was determined to sort of open a boutique, a fashion house in his area where his peers sort of didn't have any access to. And so in 1970, while at a flea market, apparently Takada met a woman who wanted to rent out a small space to him. And cheaply, he accepted the offer. And with no money, basically, to afford any professional models or anything, he and his friends basically started to put together their company, if you will. And they made the interior of the shop have this jungle-like aesthetic. If you know your perfume, you know that plays a part in one of their fragrances. So it had this sort of a jungle-like aesthetic. And actually, the designer decided to name his first store Jungle Jap. That was the name of the very first store, Jungle Jap. And of course, the name went with some controversy. And you know, in 1971, apparently, what ended up happening is the Japanese American Citizens League summoned him to remove the word Jap from his business's name and all of this stuff. The state Supreme Court upheld his ability to use the term, and so it was there was like a legal fight over it. But long story short is his risk paid off. He ended up becoming more and more well known in fashion circles and began leading the way on some different things. He opened up his flagship store, Kenzo, in 1976, I believe it was. And interestingly enough, in 78 and 79, he actually held shows in a circus tent. So he did some very unorthodox things. He took a lot of chances, but he went against the stream, and I like that. His business sort of flourished because of it. And so he released a perfume, his very first experiment into perfumes. He released a fragrance called King Kong. Okay, this is 1980. He released a fragrance called King Kong. And when they asked why he created it, because I only think it lasted a couple years and then it got discontinued or something, he said he created it just for fun. That he just created the fragrance for fun because he felt like it. King Kong, I've never smelled King Kong de Kenzo from 1980. It's sort of a spicy green fragrance, apparently, with a banana note. So, how's that for interesting? A banana note. The very first Kenzo for men that I know of is the famous Kenzo pour Homme, which is sort of like this, Kenzo Pour Homme is sort of like this ozonic, fresh, aquatic, imagine like a aquatic barbershop, if that's such a thing. Because there's this very traditional masculine barbershop element, but there's also a very, for the 90s, for 1991, there's a very modern sort of ozonic outdoor freshness to it as well. I'm hesitating to say marine or aquatic. I mean, it is technically I think this is supposed to be like shoot of bamboo or something. That's the design. I'm not 100% sure what the bottle is supposed to represent, but I'm guessing. From looking at some of the other bottles, my bottle doesn't have any texture on it, but there are some other bottles that have texture on it. There's some leaves, like his name. I think the older bottles have some of that. So yeah, I think it was supposed to be a piece of bamboo. I'm not 100% sure though. And Christian Mathieu created this. Christian Mathieu created this. And it's for an ozonic, it's not bad. It's not my favorite Kenzo. I'll actually take the aforementioned Kenzo Jungle Pour Homme, but Kenzo Pour Homme is not too bad. Okay, next on the list, we're going to talk about a brand that there's not very much out there about. It's actually going to be the House of Dunhill. And so if you go to Richemont's website, who we talked about them owning another company earlier as well. You know, they're, I think it was Cartier, if I'm not mistaken. So Richemont owns Dunhill as well. And so they have a very small blurb on the House of Dunhill, but it's very hard to get information on Alfred Dunhill. So building on 130 years of British craftsmanship and innovation, Dunhill is the foremost British men's luxury house for today, a trusted destination of elevation, classicism, hedonism, and solace for our audience. I hate reading these things. Basically, Alfred Dunhill sort of specialized in ready-to-wear, custom, bespoke menswear leather goods. And he was a tobacconist, as they called it. He was a tobacconist back in the day, where you could go in there, you could get tobacco for your pipe, you could, you know, have them roll a cigar with a specific type of tobacco that you liked. And he also had some patents. For example, he patented a pipe called a windshield pipe, which helped drivers smoke while driving. He also patented a traveling humidor. Okay, he had a patent on a traveling humidor, and the very first Dunhill produced one of the very first butane gas lighters. So he was big into the cigar scene. Alfred Dunhill is a huge name in cigar, and I think it was actually his father who started the cigar business, and he inherited it and kind of took it to the next level, if I'm not mistaken. But Alfred Dunhill came out with his very first fragrance in 1934, and it makes perfect sense because he ended up coming up with this fragrance called Dunhill For Men. And this is a modern bottle. I actually have a vintage bottle on the way at some point. I have no clue when it's going to be here, sometime probably in the next couple months. So the modern was called Dunhill Cologne for Men, or Classic Blend. Is how it was titled sometimes. But the older bottles we usually just say Cologne, Dunhill Cologne for Men. And like this particular bottle is distributed by, I can't see it. Yeah, I can't see who, but this is a more modern bottle. It's not very good. I do not like the modern as much. Rumor is, though, this is discontinued altogether. So I'm probably going to end up keeping this, even though I have an older bottle on the way, which I'm very much looking forward to trying. It's lavender, clary sage, lemon, petitgrain, carnation, iris, jasmine, rose, cedar, leather, tonka bean, and vetiver. And I think there's a little bit of a connection between that tonka bean in the base and tobacco. Okay, there's a little bit of that dry tonka tobacco combination, and it harkens back to Dunhill's history. It makes sense. It's sort of woody, sort of floral. Interesting fragrance. It's not my favorite, but it's interesting, and it's good enough for me to want to take a chance on a vintage and see how different the vintage is. I've had very good luck and success doing that. Okay, now, next on the list, we have everyone's favorite brand today, and that is Tom Ford. Now, Tom Ford is sort of a audacious success story. He is born Thomas Carlisle Ford in Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1961, studying architecture at the famous Parsons School of Design, when basically during his last year, they say fashion came calling and he had to leave. It's according to the Perfume Society. He took a job with almost zero experience, moved to Milan to work for Gucci in 1990, and after a few years found himself at its helm, becoming creative director in 1994. How insane is that? How absolutely nuts is that? Studying architecture at the Paris campus, doesn't know what he wants to do with his life, knows he wants to be in fashion, leaves with zero experience. 4 years later, he's the creative director. What the F? So he created many, of course, acclaimed collections for the brand of Gucci, and won numerous awards. And sort of, he's credited with reviving Gucci. Not just Gucci, but Yves Saint Laurent. So you know the fragrances that he's sort of influenced and put his time in. You hear the names. I've talked about them many a times on the channel. The work that he did at places like Gucci, when stuff like Envy for Men came out, or stuff like the Gucci Pour Homme 1. Michel Almerac in 2003, and then in 2004 he left Gucci, and he left the Gucci group in 2004, and everyone was kind of wondering what he was going to do in 2004. What's he going to do? What's he going to do with his next foray into fashion? Because everyone knew he was going to start his own house by that point. By 2004, he was such a big name, everyone pretty much knew he was going to start a house. And I think that's exactly what he did. 2005, he trademarked the name Tom Ford. And 2006, he launched his very first line of fragrances, starting with the fragrance I don't have a bottle of, but I do have a decant. So we'll do a review on the channel one day of it. And it is a fragrance called Tom Ford's Black Orchid. Black Orchid is sort of a little bit of a legend by now. It's not my favorite fragrance, I'll tell you that. I don't hate it or anything, but it's not my favorite. I'm not going to run out and go buy a bottle or anything. It's sort of like a sweet floral oriental, if you will. It's got a very interesting black truffle note. Some people say that it has a, how can I say this for YouTube to be family oriented? Some people say that it has a very sexual innuendo tied to this fragrance. If you don't know what it is, look it up on your own. There's blackcurrant, ylang-ylang, black truffle, and bergamot in the top, with black orchid, floral notes, fruity notes, and lotus wood, with a base of balsams, frankincense, patchouli, sandalwood, vanilla, and vetiver. So sort of like a sweet floral oriental. Not my favorite fragrance, but not bad. It is done by one of my favorite perfumers, though. Pierre Negrin and David Appel did Black Orchid. And then in 2007, that's where he released his very first fragrance for men, and it ended up being Tom Ford for Men, which is actually discontinued now, believe it or not, very sadly. There was also an extreme version, which I absolutely want, but I can't find it at a fair price anyways, what I think is a fair price. I'll tell you a funny story about what I think is a fair price. I was at work today, and my buddy was, he knows I'm into perfume, and he sometimes gives me shit, and he was telling me, I'm going to bring you this Tim McGraw perfume to wear. He brought Tim McGraw apparently like a decade ago, right? And I was like, look it up. Let's look it up. So I looked it up and I was like, dude, it's discontinued. So he looks it up on eBay and it's $200-300 a bottle. Tim McGraw. And I was like, oh, dude, welcome to modern perfume, my friend. Welcome. Everything. He couldn't believe it. He was like, this thing was $20. I just bought it at Walgreens years ago. I was like, yep, now it's $200 to $300. It's discontinued. But yeah, it's a shame. This is discontinued and the Extreme is discontinued. The rate of discontinuations are getting unbelievable. I mean, the houses would rather just axe it and put out something new to try to build hype. You know, they don't care about keeping classics around anymore. Hence the this shows is discontinued and this shows is discontinued. Two of the most iconic fragrances from the 1930s, both on Parfumo, show discontinued. Absolute shame if that's true. And honestly, shame Tom Ford For Men is discontinued too, because I think this is an amazing woody, spicy fragrance for summer, for the heat. This is the kind of fragrance, this is the kind of tobacco I want to wear in the heat. There's very few tobaccos that do well in the heat. This is one of them because it has this citrusy, fresh, uplifting sort of ginger, fizzy, sparkly citrus. It's beautiful. The Italian bergamot, there's lemon leaf, there's violet, but the tobacco absolute, normally tobacco is a very heavy, note. Perfect for the cold. This is the opposite. This is sort of a all year round, and there's a note of cypriol on the base, which makes it even more crazy that this is great for the heat. But I found it's great for the heat. Beautiful. But there's a warmth to it. There's a warmth to sort of the citrusy, woody spiciness as well. Great fragrance. Yves Cesar and Pascal Guerin created that. Okay, and then I want to talk about the house of Dusita. Now, Dusita is a newer house, actually. She only founded the house, I believe, in 2016, if I'm not mistaken. And she is listed as a self-trained perfumer. There's a beautiful interview with her on Kafkaesk's blog. If you want to check that out, I would highly recommend it. She's a native to Thailand, and she apparently moved to Paris, started her own brand in 2015, and so apparently Kafkaesk was a big fan. Says you can feel that she's very sincere and authentic. It's not just marketing hyperbole. She's not just pontificating about how the fragrance is going to magically alter space-time continuum or anything like that. This is her true love and desire. Fair enough. She's a new house. You have the right to be skeptical. Her name is Pisara Umavijjani. I probably butchered the hell out of that. Let me try again. Pisara Umavijjani. And Umavijjani, again, is of Thai descent. And so because of that, she weaves these sort of Eastern influences into her French compositions. Okay, that's sort of her style. And the very first fragrance she put out, what a ballsy release this is. This is a 2016 release. And I truly, truly wish that, that I would have bought a full bottle of this. There's actually another fragrance that she put out in 2016 that I have a full bottle of and I forgot to grab. It's locked up. But I've talked about it on the channel. You guys have seen that one. That's Isara. That's sort of her, I guess, take on like a fougere, twist on a modern fougere. But this is the one that I really kicked myself for not buying a full bottle of, and it's Oudh Infini. I'm glad to have what I have. I'll do a full review of this one day for you guys, because I do have still a very respectable decant here. But basically, in a nutshell, Oudh Infini is an animalic floral with a beautiful Laotian oud note and a fantastic rose, beautiful May rose note, and you can even see the rose highlighted on her card. And civet, animalic civet with lots of musk. This is a very musky affair. The musk hits you straight away from the get-go, but you also get some Tunisian orange blossom. She claims Mysore sandalwood. Who knows? Benzoin Siam, bourbon vanilla absolute. But what a fragrance. I wish I would have bought a full bottle before it's discontinued. But again, I'm glad to have what I have, and I'll review this before my decant is dry. So, what a first release, though. What a ballsy release by Dusita. And then, that leaves us with one. And I wanted to close with this because it's part comic relief and it's part, you choose what you want to believe. But the House of Creed. So the House of Creed, it's interesting because I've noticed that Creed has changed tactics ever since BlackRock bought them. I truly think that BlackRock was in the process of buying Creed when all of this information about Olivier Creed's past, let's say, really started to come out. People on the internet started to more and more wake up to what was going on at the House of Creed. And it was right around the time they paid almost $1 billion for it. And so they were in a little bit of a bind. They couldn't continue with this hoity-toity royal, I built this fragrance for the Queen of Spain in 1899. They just couldn't continue down that road. So if you look on their website and you actually go to history, it's very interesting how they've changed tactics. You can see it. The House of Creed has a notable history that extends over 250 years, with 7 generations that have shaped the fragrance house. The history of the brand is a matter of public record. Keen to explore what that looked like, the House of Creed looked to a professional archivist to investigate, this is on the Creed website, to investigate the archives of the Creed family. These revealed that the Creed family did not initially start in fragrance business, but rather had an entrepreneurial history from leather tailors to courtiers prior to becoming perfumers. That is on the Creed website, ladies and gentlemen. They're not out there publishing it. Well, they are. Actually, they made a magazine, but they're sort of, they're not waving their hands and shouting about it, but they've almost like admitted. I mean, just the simple fact that this guy didn't get sued into oblivion tells you that every word in this book is true or can be verified. And so there's an entire magazine they put out, like I said, dedicated to it. And they had a tailoring business. That's what they were. They were tailors. And they, anyways, I would urge you to go read that if you're interested in seeing the tactics that BlackRock has decided how they want to play their hand with Creed. I think they should personally just sell the damn brand. BlackRock has no business owning Creed, in my opinion. They have no clue what to do. They haven't released anything worth a shit. They haven't even tried to release anything worth a shit lately, in my opinion. Their last release was like Royal Wind or some insane name that is just an absolute joke. The new bottle design looks like they straight off just ripped off the like they copied the bottle design of L'Instant de Guerlain, but they put like a fancy freaking little Creed cap on top, but it looks very similar to this. Very similar to this bottle design. Not cool. Not cool at all. Not a fan of where the House of Creed is going. I'll tell you that, in case I haven't made myself clear. But there is a fragrance that they put out. There is a fragrance that they put out that they claimed Royal English Leather is what the name is. I've talked about it on the channel before. They claim this was their very first fragrance for the King of England, King George III, in 1781. That Creed was the King's official glove maker, and that the King wanted his gloves to be scented with the scent of Royal English Leather. The King loved the scented glove so much, he asked Creed to make it a personal perfume. So whenever people look to or point out the fact that, well, if Creed was making fragrances for all of this time, how come there's no bottles? There's old bottles of Chanel's and there's old bottles of Carons and Parfums d'Orsay, and there's all these bottles that are out there from these other companies. Where are the Creed bottles? Where are the Creed bottles before Olivier Creed founded the brand or what's the word? Trademarked the name or whatever it was in the late 1960s. That was the first sort of, that was the first record of Creed sort of popping up as bottles, as a bottle collector. Why are there no bottles from 1899 or 1900 or anything like that? And they'll say, oh, well, you have to remember, Creed made these bottles for royalty. So it was like a one-person bottle, and that was all. So they probably just all got lost to history. I bet you that even if they made one bottle for whoever it was, this king or that queen or this prince or that, heir, that we would have seen it. We would have seen the bottles, is my guess. And so reading that little blurb from the House of Creed, that we looked to a professional archivist to investigate the archives of the Creed family. That wasn't done before you paid $1 billion? I'm just very curious about this. So if you go off of what they claim, which they used to have a place where you could, they used to have a place where you could actually search and it would say, this fragrance is vaulted. Creed calls it vaulted. We vaulted the fragrance. We'll bring it out of the vault soon, and you can't do that anymore. You can't see their little blurb. Now, the internet is forever, so I'm sure people have screenshots of Creed's, advertising practices and stuff like that. And if you go to Fragrantica, you can actually see the blur. I'm sure they'll probably tell them to take it down if they if they ever watch this video and hear me saying this. But that little blurb I read you, Royal English Leather is the first fragrance created by Creed, ordered by King George III in 1781. 1781. Creed was the king's glove maker, and he scented the king's gloves with Royal English Leather. The king loved the scented glove so much that he asked Creed to make it a personal perfume. The perfume is rich and dense with soft citrus top on a leather and woods base. A true classic for both men and women who appreciate history. I think that's directly from Creed. I don't think Fragrantica wrote that. I think that's a quote directly from the brand. So, yeah, I mean, I would tell you to read this book. Number one, this is a great book, and it'll give you insight into how dirty the fragrance game can be. Number two, I like this scent. I love this scent. In fact, this is my favorite, one of my favorite summer leather fragrances there is. And it's definitely my favorite EDT. These gray caps were EDTs. This is my favorite EDT from Creed, hands down. Acier Aluminum is the only one that can come close to this. Those two are my two favorite gray cap creations. But 1781, come on, guys. I mean, Jickie was 1889, and it was considered to be the first, modern artistic perfume where it wasn't just like gardenia or jasmine or, there was like a first true artistic composition where someone came, and that was 1889. You guys are saying more than 100 years earlier, you created this? I don't know. I obviously, well, we have our hunches, and so it's just very interesting to me. Very interesting that just reading that advertising, I figured I would share the change of tactics that Creed has taken on their own website. Nevertheless, so go read it, check it out. It's very interesting. Very interesting change of tactics. And you know what? I have vowed I am never, ever going to buy a new Creed fragrance until they come on here and personally apologize for selling me what was the biggest joke of a fragrance in 2018. I bought a flacon of Aventus. I've shown it on the channel before. It literally, when I say it didn't last 30 minutes, I mean it didn't last. If I doused myself and then went to the office, by the time I got to the office, poof, it's gone. It didn't smell anything like the other batches of Aventus that I bought. And I think that was around the time where Olivier Creed was trying to like make as much money as he can to sell the house. That's my theory anyways. So not a fan of the new direction of Creed. But I love my old Creeds, but I'm vowing to never buy any more until I get a refund or an apology or something from the house. When they put out the new, what do they call it? What was the Green Valley? When Creed puts out the new version of Green Valley, I expect a bottle sent for, reparations for the pain and suffering and agony I had to go through buying the 2018 batch of Aventus. And I have had 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17. That was 18. That was my 6th year. So I know what Aventus is supposed to smell like. It was not that 2018 batch. That's where I completely stopped. Creed lost me as a client right then and there. Now, I would say they should be ashamed, but hey, Olivier Creed laughed all the way to his, he made out like an absolute bandit. He's living in some castle somewhere, literally living like the kings he pretended to create fragrances for. Anyways, enough of that. I appreciate everyone watching the launch episode, part 2. There probably won't be a part 3 just because I don't know if I have any more brands really that I want to highlight what their first fragrances are. But any big old French brands anyways. Obviously, we could talk about things like my friend Russian Adam, who is coming on the channel in the next week or two, God willing, to talk about his new collection, the History of Oudh collection. But like Ottoman Empire was his very first fragrance. So yes, we can talk about stuff like that. But big French brands, I think we pretty much knocked most of them out. So if you have any other brands as a recommendation, do let me know. I hope you enjoyed the video highlighting some of the backstory of the fragrance houses, where they started, which fragrances they started with. Cheers, guys, and I very much hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.